The moment George Gordon stepped out of his battered spacecraft, he knew he was in trouble. The alien females surrounding him had never seen a human male before, and they couldn't resist their curiosity. George emerged from the smoking wreckage, his spacesuit torn and his heart pounding. The crash landing had pierced Brunelia's atmospheric barrier, ending centuries of isolation for the planet's all-female inhabitants. He found himself face-to-face with a group of shocked Brunali scientists, their iridescent skins shimmering in the alien sunlight. Opal, the lead xenobiologist, stepped forward, her plant-like features contorted in a mix of fear and fascination. "Contain the alien," she ordered, her voice firm but tinged with excitement. "We must examine it thoroughly." As the Brunali escorted George to their research facility, he observed their advanced biotechnology. The buildings seemed to grow from the ground, pulsing with life. The alien's skin emitted subtle, enticing scents, pheromones, he realized. At the facility, Opal conducted a meticulous examination of George. Her scientific detachment gradually gave way to personal interest as she studied his unfamiliar anatomy. George felt vulnerable under her probing gaze, acutely aware of the growing tension in the room. News of the humans' arrival spread like wildfire across Brunalia. Crowds gathered outside the facility, their collective curiosity palpable. Inside, George overheard heated debates among Brunali leaders. Some called for his immediate termination, fearing contamination of their society. Others argued for further study, recognizing potential benefits from this unprecedented contact. Opal found herself torn between duty and desire. As she recorded George's vital signs, she couldn't help but notice the strange effect he had on her and her colleagues. Long dormant instincts stirred within them, threatening to upend their stable, all-female society. George, sensing the precariousness of his situation, began formulating an escape plan. He knew his survival, and possibly the future of human-Brunali relations, depended on his next moves. As he plotted, he couldn't shake the feeling that his mere presence was causing a fundamental shift in Brunali biology and society. Outside, the crowd grew larger and more agitated. The once orderly Brunali society teetered on the brink of chaos, all because of one human male. George realized he needed to act fast before the situation spiraled out of control. As night fell on Brunalia, George prepared for his daring escape attempt. Little did he know, his actions would not only determine his fate but also spark a revolution that would forever change this alien world. The Brunali girls had never seen a human male before, and now they couldn't resist the call of their awakening instincts. The stage was set for a clash of species, cultures, and desires that would reshape the galaxy. George's heart raced as he surveyed the growing crowd outside the research facility. The once orderly Brunali society was unraveling before his eyes, and he knew he was the catalyst. He turned to Opal, who was monitoring his vital signs with trembling hands. "What's happening out there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Opal's plant-like features contorted with worry. "Your presence, it's triggering something in us. Our biology is changing, awakening long-dormant instincts." As if to emphasize her point, a wave of pheromones washed over George, making his head spin. He watched as Opal's iridescent skin pulsed with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "We need to continue our tests," Opal said, her scientific detachment slipping, "for the sake of both our species." Over the next few days, George found himself subjected to an increasing battery of examinations. Opal's touch lingered longer than necessary during physical assessments, and their conversations strayed from purely scientific topics. They shared stories of their home worlds, finding common ground despite their vast differences. Meanwhile, the situation outside deteriorated rapidly. News of George's arrival had spread across Brunalia, causing widespread chaos. Reports flooded in of Brunali females experiencing intense, unfamiliar urges. The once stable society teetered on the brink of collapse. In the halls of government, Prime Minister Zara paced furiously. Her stern features were set in a deep frown as she addressed her cabinet. "This human poses an existential threat to our way of life," she declared. "We must remove him immediately." Science Minister Lyra stood in opposition. "But think of the potential benefits. We could learn so much from this cultural exchange." Their debate was interrupted by an aide bursting into the room. "Prime Minister, There's been in development. A group calling themselves the Purists has formed. They're threatening violence against the human and his supporters. Zara's eyes narrowed. Increased security at the research facility. We cannot allow this situation to spiral further out of control. Back at the facility, George's keen ears picked up snippets of conversation from the guards outside his room. He pieced together the growing threat to his safety. That night, as Opal conducted her final test for the day, he gripped her arm gently. "Opal, I need your help," he whispered urgently. "I don't think I'm safe here anymore." Opal's inner conflict played across her face. She glanced at the door, then back at George. "You're right," she said finally. "I have a plan, but we'll need to move quickly." Over the next few hours, Opal outlined her escape plan. Her sister Nova would provide transportation. They would use Opal's access codes to slip out of the facility under cover of darkness. As they finalized the details, alarms suddenly blared throughout the building. The sound of weapons fire echoed from the lower levels. "The Purists!" Opal gasped. "They're here!" George sprang into action. "We need to go now!" Opal quickly entered her access code, and the door slid open. They raced down the corridor, the sounds of combat growing louder. Rounding a corner, they came face to face with a group of Purists, led by a fierce-looking Brunali with blazing eyes. "There's the human!" the leader, Vera, shouted. "Capture him!" George and Opal turned and fled in the opposite direction. They weaved through the facility's winding corridors, narrowly avoiding both Purist forces and government security. The building's biotechnology pulsed erratically, reflecting the chaos within. They reached a service tunnel, slipping inside just as a group of pursuers rushed past. The dark, cramped space filled with the scent of their mingled pheromones, adding to the intensity of the moment. "This way," Opal whispered, leading George through the labyrinthine passages. After what felt like hours, they emerged into the cool night air. A sleek hover transport waited nearby, its engine humming softly. Nova, bearing a striking resemblance to Opal, waved them over urgently. "Hurry," she called. "Government forces are closing in." As they sprinted toward the vehicle, spotlights suddenly illuminated the area. A booming voice echoed across the ground. "This is Prime Minister Zara. You are ordered to surrender the human immediately. Failure to comply will result in severe consequences." George, Opal, and Nova dove into the transport. Nova's hands flew across the controls, and the vehicle shot into the air, narrowly avoiding a barrage of stun blasts from the security forces below. As they soared over the glowing Brunali cityscape, George looked back at the research facility. Flames licked at its lower levels, and the once orderly streets were filled with chaos. He turned to Opal, whose expression mirrored his own mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Where are we going?" he asked. Opal's eyes gleamed with drive. "To the wilderness. There's an old outpost where you can work on repairing your ship. But first, we need to lose our pursuers." Nova banked the transport sharply, diving into a deep ravine to evade the government vessels now in pursuit. As they raced through the alien landscape, George realized that his adventure on Brunalia was nowhere near the end. The fate of two worlds now rested on his shoulders, and the real challenges were only beginning. The hover transport streaked through the night sky, its engines whining as Nova pushed them to their limits. George clung to his seat, his squeezing hard as they weaved between towering alien structures and plunged into narrow ravines. Opal's eyes were fixed on the rear scanner, watching for signs of pursuit. "We're clear for now," she announced, her voice tight with tension. "But they'll be right behind us once they regroup." As if on cue, the transport shuddered violently. Warning lights flashed across the control panel, and Nova fought to maintain control. "What's happening?" George shouted over the sudden cacophony of alarms. Nova's fingers danced across the controls, her face contorted in concentration. "The magnetic fields. They're interfering with our systems. I can't—" The transport lurched sideways, throwing its occupants against the walls. With a final, sputtering whine, the engines cut out completely. They were falling. "Brace for impact!" Nova yelled, yanking hard on the manual controls. The transport plummeted through a canopy of bioluminescent foliage, branches snapping and cracking against the hull. With a bone-jarring thud, they hit the ground, skidding to a stop in a clearing. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, with a groan, George pushed himself up from the floor. "Everyone okay?" Opal nodded, rubbing a bruise on her arm. Nova was already at the hatch, peering out into the alien wilderness. "We can't stay here," she said urgently. "The crash will lead them right to us. We need to move." They gathered what supplies they could salvage and ventured into the forest. The floor around them pulsed with an eerie internal light, casting everything in a surreal glow. As they pushed through the undergrowth, George noticed the plants seemed to react to their presence. Vines curled away from their path, while other plants extended tendrils towards them, as if curious. "Fascinating," Opal murmured, her scientific interest momentarily overriding her fear. "The flora here is highly responsive to external stimuli. I've never seen anything like it." As they trudged on, George found himself peppering Opal and Nova with questions about their world. Despite their dire situation, the sisters were eager to share, their eyes lighting up as they described Brunali culture and biology. "Our society has been stable for centuries," Opal explained, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "But now, with your arrival, everything's changing." Nova nodded, her expression troubled. "We've always reproduced through parthenogenesis, a form of asexual reproduction, but it's becoming less effective. Our population has been in slow decline for generations." George absorbed this information, his mind racing with the implications. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in Opal and Nova's behavior. Their eyes lingered on him longer. Their voices took on a softer tone when addressing him directly. The air around them seemed charged with an unspoken tension. Suddenly, a distant humming sound cut through the forest's ambient noise. The trio froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Drones," Opal whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They quickened their pace, pushing deeper into the wilderness. The dense foliage provided some cover, but the humming grew steadily louder. As they crested a hill, Nova pointed to a structure barely visible through the trees. "There, it looks like an old temple. We can hide there." They raced towards the ancient building, its stone facade covered in twisting vines. Just as they reached the entrance, a sleek, metallic drone burst through the canopy above them. George ducked, feeling the rush of air as it passed overhead. Opal slammed her hand against a worn panel beside the massive stone doors. To their surprise, they slid open with a groan of ancient mechanisms. The trio darted inside, and the doors rumbled shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. For a moment they stood in silence, catching their breath. Then, one by one, bioluminescent patterns on the walls began to glow, illuminating a vast, circular chamber. Dust-covered artifacts and strange machinery lined the walls, hints of a forgotten past. As they explored the temple, George noticed Opal and Nova growing increasingly agitated. Their skin seemed to glow more intensely, and the air filled with a sweet, intoxicating scent. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Opal shook her head, as if trying to clear it. "I'm not sure. It's like our bodies are reacting to something here. Our pheromone production is increasing dramatically." George felt his own pulse quicken in response. He forced himself to focus on their surroundings, trying to ignore the growing attraction he felt towards his alien companions. As they delved deeper into the temple, they discovered a hidden chamber. At its center stood a sleek cylindrical pod, its surface covered in intricate patterns. Opal approached it cautiously, her eyes widening as she studied the readouts on a nearby console. "This is impossible," she breathed. "It's a cryostasis chamber, and it contains a male Brunali." The revelation hit them like a shockwave. Nova stumbled back, her face a mask of disbelief. "But how? We've never had males in our recorded history." Before they could process this earth-shattering discovery, alarms blared throughout the temple. On a dusty view screen, they saw government forces and purists approaching, led by the fierce-looking Vera. "They've found us," George said grimly. His eyes darted around the room, landing on a large ornate device near the cryo chamber. An idea began to form in his mind. A desperate, dangerous plan. "I think I know how we can get out of this," he said, turning to Opal and Nova. "But it's risky and I'll need your help." as he outlined his plan to use the temple's ancient technology to create a massive pheromone pulse. Opal and Nova listened intently. The sexual tension between them crackled like electricity, but they forced themselves to focus on the task at hand. With time running out, they set to work, combining the ancient Brunali device with components from George's damaged equipment. As they made the final adjustments, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the temple. George's hand hovered over the activation switch, his heart pounding. Opal and Nova stood beside him, their bodies tense with anticipation. Just as Vera and her purist squad burst into the chamber, George took a deep breath and pressed the button. A blinding pulse of energy exploded outwards, engulfing everyone in the room. The air filled with an overwhelming surge of pheromones, and chaos erupted. In the midst of the confusion, George grabbed Opal and Nova's hands, ready to make their escape. But as the pheromone wave washed over them, he felt his own body responding in unexpected ways. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. For him, for the Brunali, and for the future of both their species. Species. The pheromone wave crashed over them like a tsunami, overwhelming their senses and igniting a primal fire within. George gasped, his body tingling with an intense, unfamiliar sensation. He could feel every cell in his body responding to the Brunali pheromones, his heart racing and skin flushing. Beside him, Opal and Nova trembled, their luminescent skin pulsing with a mesmerizing glow. The chamber erupted into chaos. Vera and her purist squad stumbled, their weapons clattering to the ground as they struggled against the sudden onslaught of desire. George seized the moment, grabbing Opal and Nova's hands. "Now's our chance," he shouted, his voice husky with hardly restrained emotion. They sprinted towards the cryo chamber, adrenaline and pheromones fueling their movements. George and Nova lifted the ancient device, its weight surprisingly manageable in their heightened state. Opal led the way, her eyes darting between the exit and the disoriented purists. As they reached the temple's entrance, George risked a glance back. Vera was on her knees, her fierce eyes now clouded with confusion and longing. For a moment, their gazes locked, and George felt a jolt of unexpected attraction. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on their escape. The trio burst into the bioluminescent forest, the cryo chamber between them. The cool night air did little to dampen the effects of the pheromone pulse. If anything, the wind seemed to carry the potent chemicals further, spreading them through the surrounding area. "We need to get to the research outpost," Opal panted, her voice strained. "It's our only chance to study the cryo chamber and potentially revive the male." Nova nodded, her hand unconsciously stroking George's arm as they ran. "It's not far, but we'll need to be careful. The pheromones are affecting everything around us." As if to emphasize her point, a nearby plant unfurled its leaves, reaching towards them with quivering tendrils. The forest itself seemed to pulse with heightened energy, responding to the supercharged atmosphere. They pressed on through the night, the weight of the cryo chamber and their own conflicting desires slowing their progress. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, sent sparks of electricity through their bodies. George found himself hyper-aware of Opal and Nova's presence, their alien beauty magnified by the pheromone-induced haze. As dawn broke, they finally reached the hidden research outpost. The sleek, low-slung building was nestled in a grove of twisting trees, its exterior designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. Opal quickly entered an access code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. They stumbled inside, setting the cryo chamber down in the main laboratory. For a moment, they stood in silence, chests heaving, the air thick with unspoken tension. Nova was the first to move, her fingers flying across a nearby console. "I'm activating the outpost shielding. It should help contain the pheromones and make us harder to track." George nodded, trying to ignore the way Nova's movement sent waves of attraction coursing through him. He turned to Opal, who was already examining the cryo chamber's control panel. "Can we revive him?" George asked, his voice low and husky. Opal bit her lip, a gesture that sent a jolt of desire through George. "I think so, but it's going to be tricky. The stasis field is incredibly complex, and the technology is far beyond anything we use today." As they worked to decipher the ancient Brunali technology, The effects of the pheromone pulse showed no signs of abating. Every brush of skin, every shared breath, heightened the growing attraction between them. George found himself constantly distracted by the graceful curves of Opal's neck, the way Nova's eyes seemed to sparkle in the lab's soft light. Hours passed in a blur of scientific discovery and simmering tension. George's human physiology proved to be unexpectedly useful, his unique biochemistry providing insights that helped stabilize the revival process. "It's working!" Opal exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "The stasis field is beginning to dissipate." As the cryochamber's translucent cover began to clear, they caught their first glimpse of the ancient Brunali male. His features were similar to Opal and Nova's, yet distinctly masculine. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, a sight that left the Brunali sisters transfixed. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the outpost. Nova rushed to a nearby monitor, her face paling. "It's Vera and the Purists. They've tracked us down." George's mind raced, torn between the need to protect their discovery and the undeniable pull he felt towards Opal and Nova. As the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air, he knew they were out of time. "We need to wake him now," George said, his voice firm despite the desire coursing through his veins. "He might be our only chance to understand what's happening and find a solution." Opal nodded, her fingers dancing across the control panel. The cryochamber hummed to life, its systems working to gently rouse its ancient occupant. As the male Brunali's eyes began to flutter, the lab's doors shuddered under the impact of purist weapons. George, Opal, and Nova huddled around the cryochamber, their bodies pressed close in anticipation and fear. The male's eyes opened fully, taking in the strange new world around him. His gaze settled on George, and a look of recognition flashed across his face. "You," he said, his voice raspy from centuries of disuse. "I've been waiting for you." Before George could respond, the lab doors burst open. Vera stood in the threshold, her eyes wild with a mixture of rage and uncontrolled desire. The pheromone-charged air crackled with tension as human, Brunali, and purist faced each other, the fate of two species hanging in the balance. Balance. The ancient Brunali male's words hung in the air, momentarily freezing everyone in place. George's mind reeled, trying to process the implications of this unexpected recognition. Vera's voice cut through the tension. "Step away from the male," she barked, her weapon trained on the group. But as she took a step forward, her body visibly shuddered. The pheromone-charged air in the lab seemed to intensify, affecting everyone present. Vera's eyes widened, her fierce expression faltering as she struggled against the overwhelming sensations. George seized the moment of confusion. "Opal, Nova, help him up," he commanded, gesturing to the ancient Brunali. As they assisted the weakened male from the cryochamber, George positioned himself between them and Vera. "Listen," he said, his voice low and steady, despite the desire coursing through his veins. "We don't have to fight. What's happening here is bigger than all of us." Vera's weapon wavered, her breathing labored. Behind her, the other purists seemed equally affected, their aggressive stances softening as the pheromones worked their influence. The ancient Brunali male spoke again, his voice stronger now. "My name is Zephyr. I've slumbered for centuries, waiting for this moment. The fate of our people hangs in the balance." His words seemed to ripple through the room, carrying a weight that transcended the immediate conflict. Even Vera lowered her weapon slightly, her expression a mix of confusion and unwilling fascination. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the outpost. Nova rushed to a nearby console, her fingers flying across the controls. "The pheromone levels are spiking across the entire planet," she exclaimed. "It's like Zephyr's awakening has triggered some kind of cascading effect." George felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the intensified pheromones making it difficult to focus. He glanced at Opal and Nova, noting the increased luminescence of their skin and the way their bodies seemed to unconsciously lean towards him and Zephyr. "We need to stabilize him," Opal said, her voice husky with scarcely controlled emotion, "and figure out what's causing this planet-wide surge." Vera took a stumbling step backward, her fierce demeanor crumbling under the onslaught of sensations. What's happening to us?" she gasped. Before anyone could respond, a new voice crackled over the outpost communication system. "This is Science Minister Lyra. I'm establishing a secure channel. Are you receiving?" Nova's eyes widened in recognition. "It's the leader of the pro-male faction," she whispered to George. "We read you, Minister," George replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Listen carefully," Lyra's voice came through, urgent but controlled. "The awakening of the ancient male has triggered a pheromone crisis beyond anything we've seen. I'm sending you access codes to our most advanced biotechnology. It's our only hope of developing a solution." As Nova worked to receive the data, George turned his attention back to Vera and her purists. The fierce warriors were now slumped against the walls, overcome by the intense pheromone effects. "We need to work together," George said, extending a hand to Vera. "The entire planet is at stake." Vera looked up at him, her eyes clouded with a mix of desire and lingering defiance. After a moment's hesitation, she grasped his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. "What do you need us to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Over the next few hours, the unlikely alliance worked feverishly to understand and counteract the escalating pheromone crisis. Zephyr's knowledge of ancient Brunali biology proved invaluable, while George's unique human physiology offered new insights. As they worked, the intimate tension between them continued to build. George found his gaze constantly drawn to Opal's graceful movements and Nova's intense focus. He felt an unexpected connection forming with Zephyr, a sense of kinship that transcended species. The Brunali females seemed equally affected. Opal and Nova's hands would linger when passing equipment, their bodies gravitating towards both George and Zephyr. Even Vera, despite her initial hostility, found herself drawn into the complex web of attraction. Using Lyra's advanced biotechnology, they made a breakthrough. Opal's eyes lit up as she examined the results of their latest test. "This is incredible," she breathed. "A combination of human and Brunali DNA could create a compound capable of neutralizing the pheromone effects." The implications hung heavy in the air. George's heart raced as he realized what this meant. "So, to save your people," he began, "we need to engage in intimate genetic exchange," Zephyr finished, his gaze moving between George and the Brunali females. The laboratory fell silent as they all processed this information. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation and nervous energy. Nova was the first to speak. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The entire planet is depending on us." George nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement. "How do we proceed?" Opal took a deep breath, her luminescent skin pulsing with increased intensity. "We'll need to participate in a series of controlled intimate encounters," she explained. "Each pairing will produce a unique compound that we can synthesize into the stabilizing agent." As they prepared for the intimate encounters, alarms blared once again. A message from Prime Minister Zara flashed across the main screen, her face etched with concern. "This is a planet-wide alert," Zara announced. "The pheromone crisis has reached critical levels. All citizens are advised to remain in their homes while we work on a solution." The gravity of their task greatly troubled on George and his companions. They exchanged determined looks, knowing that the fate of Brunali society rested in their hands. "We should begin," Zephyr said softly, moving towards a private area of the lab. As George followed, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and nervousness, he caught sight of Vera. The once fierce purist leader watched them with a complex expression of longing, fear, and grudging hope. The door closed behind them, and George found himself alone with Zephyr and Opal. As they began the intimate process of creating the stabilizing compound, George knew that whatever happened next would change everything. For him, for the Brunali, and for the future of both their species. The intimate process of creating the stabilizing compound was interrupted by a deafening explosion that rocked the entire facility. Alarms blared as George, Zephyr, and Opal rushed out of the private area, their clothes hastily readjusted. "They're here!" Nova shouted from her position at the main console. "Vera's purists have breached the outer perimeter." George's military instincts kicked in immediately. "Opal, Nova, take defensive positions near the lab entrances. Zephyr, We need that compound finished now. As Zephyr hurried back to the synthesis station, George activated the outpost's defense systems. Reinforced blast doors slammed shut, and security fields hummed to life. Vera's voice crackled over the intercom, filled with rage and desperation. Surrender the male and the abomination. We won't let you destroy our way of life. George ignored her demands, focusing instead on coordinating their defense. He guided Opal and Nova to strategic points around the lab, utilizing their knowledge of Brunali technology to create makeshift barricades. The sound of laser fire and shattering equipment grew closer. Suddenly, the main lab doors burst open, and a group of purists poured in, wielding crude energy weapons. George sprang into action, his body moving with fluid grace despite the lingering effects of the pheromones. He engaged the first purist in hand-to-hand combat, using his superior strength to disarm her quickly. Beside him, Opal moved with equal skill. Her luminescent skin pulsed with exertion as she ducked under a wild swing and countered with a precise strike to her attacker's solar plexus. As they fought side by side, George found himself hyper-aware of Opal's presence. Their bodies seemed to move in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's movements. When a purist managed to knock George off balance, Opal was there in an instant, her back pressing against his as she deflected an incoming attack. The intimate contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, momentarily intensifying the pheromone-induced attraction. But rather than distracting them, it seemed to sharpen their focus, their movements becoming even more coordinated and lethal. Meanwhile, Nova had reprogrammed the environmental controls, filling sections of the outpost with dense fog. Purists stumbled through the mist, disoriented and separated from their comrades. Taking advantage of the confusion, Zephyr darted between workstations, gathering the final components needed for the stabilizing compound. His centuries of knowledge allowed him to work with incredible speed and precision. As the battle raged on, reports flooded the lab's communication systems. Cities across Brunalia were descending into chaos as the pheromone crisis reached its peak. Footage showed Brunali of all factions engaging in uncontrolled, intimate encounters in the streets, their usual social norms completely breaking down. Prime Minister Zara's face appeared on the main screen, her expression grave. "This is a planet-wide emergency," she announced. "All forces are ordered to cease hostilities immediately and support the efforts at the research outpost. The survival of our species depends on it." The news seemed to reach Vera and her purists, but instead of standing down, they redoubled their efforts. Vera herself led a final push towards the heart of the lab, her eyes wild with a mixture of fury and barely contained desire. "I won't let you do this," she screamed, raising her weapon towards the synthesis station where Zephyr worked. George and Opal moved as one, their bodies flowing together like water. George caught Vera's arm, twisting it to disarm her, while Opal swept her legs out from under her. They brought her down hard, pinning her to the ground. Vera struggled beneath them, but the fight seemed to drain out of her as the full force of the pheromones hit her system. Her eyes darted between George and Opal, a look of confused longing replacing her earlier rage. With the immediate threat neutralized, George helped Vera to her feet, keeping a firm grip on her arm. "It's over," he said softly. "We need to work together now." As if on cue, Zephyr emerged from the synthesis station, holding a vial of shimmering liquid. "It's ready," he announced, "but we need to act quickly." The group gathered around as Zephyr explained the compound's distribution method. "It requires direct skin contact between a human and a Brunali to catalyze the stabilization process," he said, his eyes meeting George's. George nodded, understanding the implication. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the mix of anticipation and nervousness he felt. Opal stepped forward, her skin glowing softly. "We should start with those of us here," she said, "to ensure the compound works before we begin wider distribution." As George prepared for the intimate encounters necessary to kickstart the stabilization process, government forces arrived to secure the outpost. The remaining purists were rounded up, many of them too overwhelmed by the pheromone effects to resist. Science Minister Lyra joined them via hologram, her expertise guiding them through the delicate procedure. "Remember," she cautioned, The compound must be applied during moments of peak intimacy for maximum effectiveness. George took a deep breath, looking at the Brunali females around him, Opal, Nova, and even Vera, who now watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination. He knew that what came next would not only save their civilization, but also irrevocably change his relationship with these alien women. As he stepped forward to begin the process, George caught sight of Zephyr. The ancient Brunali male gave him a nod of encouragement and understanding. In that moment, George realized that they were forging a new path for both their species, one that would redefine the boundaries of human-alien relations. With a final look at his companions, George steeled himself for the intense and transformative experiences that lay ahead. The fate of Brunalia rested in their hands, and in the intimate connections they were about to form. Forge, the intimate encounters that followed were intense, transformative, and ultimately successful. Within hours, the stabilizing compound had been distributed across Brunalia, bringing the pheromone crisis under control. As the planet slowly returned to normal, George found himself at the center of a new challenge. Prime Minister Zara summoned him, along with Opal, Nova, and Zephyr, to an emergency meeting. "We've received a transmission from Earth," Zara announced, her tone grave. "They're sending a diplomatic envoy." George felt a mix of emotions wash over him. "What do they want?" "You," Zara replied simply, "and access to our technology and biological data." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. George's mind raced, remembering his life on Earth and the duty he still felt towards humanity. Yet as he looked at Opal and Nova, he realized how much had changed. The bonds he'd formed with them, and with Brunalia itself, ran deep. Days later, a sleek Earth vessel descended through Brunalia's atmosphere. George stood beside Prime Minister Zara as the ship's doors opened, revealing a tall, charismatic man in an immaculate suit. "Ambassador Marcus Steele," the man introduced himself, his eyes scanning the assembled group before settling on George. "It's good to see you alive and well, Major Crawford." George nodded stiffly, feeling the weight of Earth's expectations on his shoulders. As the diplomatic talks began, George found himself thrust into the role of mediator. He sat between Zara and Steele, translating not just words but cultural nuances and intentions. "We're particularly interested in the biological aspects of your species," Steele said, his gaze lingering on Opal and Nova. "The pheromone situation has raised concerns back on Earth." Zara's luminescent skin pulsed with scarcely controlled indignation. "Our biology is not a weapon, Ambassador. It's part of who we are." As the negotiations wore on, George noticed a shift in Steele's demeanor. The ambassador's eyes followed Opal and Nova's movements with increasing frequency, his questions becoming more personal than diplomatic. During a break in the talks, George overheard a heated conversation between two members of the Earth delegation. "This is a waste of time, Steele," a gruff voice growled. "We should be preparing for containment, not playing nice." George recognized the speaker as Security Chief Alan Blackwood, a notoriously hardline official. "Patience, Alan," Steele replied smoothly. "There's more to be gained here than you realize." George's unease grew. He sought out Zephyr, finding the ancient Brunali male deep in thought. "We need to do something," George said. "Earth is divided on how to handle this situation." Zephyr nodded slowly. "Perhaps it's time for a more direct approach to fostering understanding between our species." The next day, Zephyr presented his proposal for a human Brunali exchange program. The idea sparked intense debate among both delegations. "This could be the key to lasting peace," Steele argued, his eyes darting between Opal and Nova. Blackwood's face darkened. "Or it could be the first step in an alien takeover." As tensions rose, George made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward, addressing both delegations. "I volunteer to demonstrate the true nature of human-Brunali relations," he announced. "A public display of the stabilizing compound's application." The room erupted in chaos. Zara looked concerned, Steele intrigued, and Blackwood furious. "This is madness," Blackwood sputtered. "Crawford, I'm ordering you to stand down." But George stood firm. "With all due respect, sir, I'm no longer under Earth's command. My place is here, bridging the gap between our species. As preparations for the public demonstration began, George noticed increased activity among Blackwood's security team. They moved with purpose, speaking in hushed tones and eyeing the Brunali with suspicion. Opal approached George, her skin glowing with concern. "Are you sure about this? There's no going back once we do this." George took her hand, feeling the now familiar surge of connection between them. "I'm sure. It's the only way to show both worlds that peace is possible." As they made final preparations for the demonstration, none of them noticed the shadowy figures moving into position around the diplomatic compound. Blackwood's extraction team was in place, ready to seize their targets at a moment's notice. George took a deep breath, stepping onto the platform where he and Opal would perform the intimate act that could change the course of interspecies relations forever. As cameras from both Earth and Brunalia focused on them, the air crackled with tension and possibility. Little did they know, the real danger lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Strike. As George and Opal prepared to demonstrate the intimate application of the stabilizing compound, the air crackled with tension and possibility. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility, shattering the charged atmosphere. Security feeds flashed to life, revealing Blackwood's extraction team breaching the perimeter. The operatives moved with military precision, armed with stunners and ominous-looking containment units. George's eyes met Opal's, a silent understanding passing between them. They needed to act fast. "Zephyr, Nova," he called out, gesturing for them to gather close. As the team huddled together, Zephyr's ancient eyes gleamed with persistence. "I have an idea," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The pheromone crisis may have ended, but our biology still holds power." Nova nodded, catching on quickly. "The dispersal system," she whispered, her luminescent skin pulsing with excitement. George watched as Zephyr moved swiftly to a hidden panel, his fingers dancing across a complex array of controls. Within seconds, a barely perceptible mist began to fill the air. "A calming blend," Zephyr explained, "designed to induce suggestibility in humans." As Blackwood's team stormed through the corridors, their aggressive shouts began to falter. The pheromone-laced air worked its subtle magic, replacing their hostility with a growing sense of wonder. George seized the moment, stepping out to confront Blackwood directly. The security chief's eyes widened in recognition, his weapon wavering. "Chief Blackwood," George said, his voice steady and calm, "this isn't the way. Let me show you the truth about our relationship with the Brunali." Blackwood's defenses, lowered by the pheromones, crumbled in the face of George's sincerity. I don't understand," he mumbled, lowering his weapon. As George engaged Blackwood, Opal and Nova sprang into action. They moved through the facility with fluid grace, neutralizing the remaining hostile forces. Opal wielded a device that emitted targeted electromagnetic pulses, disabling weapons and communication equipment. Nova followed close behind, administering precise doses of pheromone-laced sedatives to subdue the most resistant operatives. The scene that greeted Ambassador Steele upon his arrival was far from what he expected. Instead of a violent confrontation, he found a tableau of peaceful resolution. Blackwood sat with George, engaged in intense conversation, while Brunali and humans alike moved about in a state of calm cooperation. Steele's face registered shock, then understanding, and finally, a hint of admiration. This changes everything," he murmured. In the aftermath of the failed extraction attempt, George knew they needed a bold move to cement the newfound understanding between Earth and Brunalia. He approached Steele and Prime Minister Zara, who had just arrived on the scene. "We need to show both worlds the true potential of our alliance," George said, his voice filled with conviction. "I propose a public ceremony, a symbolic union between our species." Zara's luminescent skin pulsed with intrigue. "What do you suggest, George?" "A bonding ritual," he replied, glancing at Opal and Nova, "combining elements from both human and Brunali traditions. With your permission, the three of us would be the first participants." Steele's eyes widened. "A public demonstration of intimate relations?" George nodded. "Not explicit, but intimate enough to show the beauty of our connection. Zephyr can officiate, representing Brunelia's rediscovered male population. As preparations for the ceremony began, news of the event spread like wildfire across both planets. Anticipation built as the day approached, with speculation running rampant about what the ritual would entail. The chosen venue was a vast amphitheater, its walls embedded with bioluminescent Brunali flora. As twilight fell, the plants began to pulse with soft, mesmerizing light. George stood at the center of the stage, flanked by Opal and Nova. Their bodies were adorned with intricate patterns of glowing pigments, a fusion of human body art and Brunali bioluminescence. Zephyr stood before them, his ancient form commanding respect and awe from the assembled crowd. As cameras broadcast the event to billions across two worlds, Zephyr began the ceremony. He spoke of the long history of both species, of the challenges they had faced, and of the bright future that lay ahead. George, Opal, and Nova exchanged vows, their words a blend of Earth languages and the musical tones of Brunali speech. As they spoke, the surrounding flora responded, pulsing in harmony with their emotions. The climax of the ceremony arrived as George prepared to apply the stabilizing compound. He locked eyes with Opal, then Nova, feeling the deep connection that had grown between them. With gentle, reverent motions, he traced the shimmering liquid across their skin. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. Waves of bioluminescence rippled across Opal and Nova's bodies, synchronized with George's touch. The surrounding plants erupted in a dazzling light show, responding to the surge of pheromones. As the ceremony concluded, Prime Minister Zara and Ambassador Steele stepped forward. With the newly bonded trio as witnesses, they signed a historic treaty establishing the Interspecies Exchange Program. The amphitheater erupted in cheers, the sound echoing across Brunalia and via broadcast throughout the solar system. As George stood there, hand in hand with Opal and Nova, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new era for both species. In the days that followed, the first wave of human volunteers arrived on Brunalia, eager to participate in the exchange program. Scientists from both worlds began collaborative projects, exploring new frontiers in biotechnology and pheromone applications. George found himself at the center of it all, working tirelessly to facilitate understanding between humans and Brunali. Yet even as he threw himself into his new role, he couldn't help but wonder about the long-term implications of this interspecies alliance. As he watched a group of human scientists marveling at a Brunali biotech demonstration, a thought occurred to him. How would this rapid exchange of knowledge and culture reshape both societies? And what new challenges might arise as humans and Brunali grew closer? With these questions swirling in his mind, George set off to meet with the latest group of Earth dignitaries. The future was uncertain but full of potential, and he was determined to see this new era of cooperation thrive.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.